Hi, my name is Paul Variappa and I'm an attorney. I'm making this video because I need the public's help in pushing Congress to investigate the United States Supreme Court for corruption and violating laws on white supremacy. I've created a website called corruptsupremecourt.com which explains everything. I'd appreciate it if you could send a copy to whoever represents you in Congress asking that they look into this. And I'd also appreciate it if you could make this video go viral so other people know what's going on. Recently, the United States Supreme Court overturned affirmative action in Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard under Title VI, which prevents race discrimination in any program or activity which receives federal funding. The problem is that non-whites weren't able to enforce this law. What's been happening is, in order to overturn abortion, the federal courts were packed with white men. Under Donald Trump, 85% of his appointees were white males, and currently the federal judiciary is 73% white male. The problem is these white males that were being appointed to overturn abortion were themselves white supremacists. What's been happening is cases where non-whites were making claims of race discrimination were being falsified and dismissed by the courts. The falsification and dismissal of these cases violated laws created during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War, which prevented race discrimination against minorities. So what was happening for cases of non-whites bringing suits for race discrimination is that their cases were falsified and dismissed. This has now led to attorneys and doctors in the state of California who are non-white receiving discipline at 4 times the rates of whites. All of this is illegal, but whenever a non-white professional tried to enforce the law, the case was falsified and dismissed. And if you check under the cases for Title VI, you will see that they were all falsified, were all dismissed. The only people that were actually able to enforce the law under Title VI were white people. And that's sort of the problem. When these cases were appealed to the United States Supreme Court, people, including myself, were bringing injunction motions. If you check on the court's calendar, every week they do a weekly orders list. And on that, at the top of the weekly orders list are the motions calendars. In cases where false statements were made by the lower courts, the United States Supreme Court was pulling these cases off the motions calendar so the public could not see them. What I'm asking is Congress pull the cases that the Supreme Court decided orders on that were not published on the weekly orders list. What they will find is that falsifications were made in those cases, and the law was applied differently to prevent a non-white from being able to enforce the law. In addition, the United States Supreme Court has been covering up that the disabled were unable to enforce their rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The United States Supreme Court decided 2 cases. One is Tennessee v. Lane and U.S. v. Georgia. In those cases, the United States Supreme Court held that the Americans with Disabilities Act was constitutional to enforce a constitutional right or a fundamental right. So everyone else who was disabled that brought a suit was not able to enforce the ADA. However, there were other provisions of law which made the ADA applicable to any recipient of federal funding. If you look under those cases, under those statutes, there are none. The federal courts were not allowing the disabled to enforce the ADA under those statutes, and were simply not citing to them. So that in the decisions of the federal courts, there's no record of those statutes ever being placed in the records. What has happened, and this explains it on my website, is that approximately 1,000 cases filed by the disabled were wrongfully dismissed. These are cases in which the defendant had actually taken these funds and agreed and signed what is known as a statement of assurances to comply with the ADA. Those people that brought up these cases, the court simply dismissed it without referencing these statutes. When these cases were brought up to the Supreme Court, they pulled it off from their weekly orders list on the motions calendar. That's why we need to look at what the Supreme Court has done. Now, this violates multiple laws that were created after the Civil War in what is known as the Reconstruction era. The crimes that the United States Supreme Court can be investigated for are violations of 18 U.S.C. 1001, false statements, violation of 18 U.S.C. 1513, which prohibits retaliation against a government witness or party to a federal proceeding. What was happening is once these cases were falsified and dismissed, they were being sent back to the courts, who were then imposing costs against the people, even though they had a right and had a right to bring the suit, and the case was dismissed simply because it was falsified by the courts. In addition, 18 U.S.C. Section 241 and 242, conspiracy to deny civil rights and denial of civil rights under color of law. This is what Derek Chauvin was charged with. This is what the Supreme Court can also be charged with for covering up that these cases were dismissed. Finally, 18 U.S.C. Section 371, conspiracy to defraud the United States, is also a crime the United States Supreme Court should be investigated for. You see, the reason that Title VI exists and the ADA exists, and those provisions which call for compliance in exchange for federal funding, is because the 40% of America's population who is non-white and the disabled were the ones paying federal taxes to fund these programs. So what's been happening is that the people that paid could not actually use the services their tax dollars were paying for. And in addition, because of what had been happening with the federal courts, attorneys and doctors are facing discipline under false charges and are losing their licenses to practice and are being excluded by whites. That is being explained in my website. So I'd appreciate it if you could contact Congress to have them investigate, and I'd appreciate it if you could share this video. Thank you.